The most powerful man on the East Coast could buy judges, bend an entire city to his will, yet for 3 long years he couldn't bring himself to open a single wooden door inside his own home, the door behind which the man who had once been his greatest legend lay in silence after a heart attack, had worn away not only his body but also his will to live. Then a poor music therapist, a woman no one ever bothered to notice, stepped across that threshold, and what she did within 60 seconds left the entire mansion frozen in stunned silence. The vinyl record shattered against the wall. "Get out, all of you!" The roar came from Declan Kavanagh, a 74-year-old man sitting deep in an armchair beside the window, the blanket slipping from his frail, withered legs, his face twisted by rage and despair. That single roar echoed through the seaside mansion outside Boston. One caregiver stumbled backward, tears streaming down her face, still clutching an unopened bottle of medicine in trembling hands. But no one answered him, because everyone standing in the hallway had witnessed this very scene 18 times before. Across the hallway stood Rowan Kavanagh, 33 years old, the unseen ruler of the waterfront and the construction world from Boston to Providence. City council members owed him favors. Even the police chief chose his words carefully whenever Rowan's name came up. Yet now, the most feared man on the East Coast simply stood there in silence, one hand resting on the heavy brass doorknob, unable to turn it. "Number 19, he said quietly. He lasted 18 minutes. The faintest smile crossed Rowan's lips. It wasn't amusement. It was the smile of a man who'd already accepted defeat. For 3 years now, his grandfather, the man who could once silence every dispute with nothing more than a calm sentence, no longer wanted to live. The heart attack had spared his body, but it had stolen his spirit. No medicine, no physician, no amount of money had been able to reach him. And no one could have imagined that only a few hours later, the 20th woman would arrive at the gates. She'd come to provide music therapy, while also helping with daily care, work that no one in the Kavanagh family had managed to keep anyone doing for very long. She didn't carry an expensive medical bag. She carried only an old instrument and a past she'd never shared with anyone. Yet she was about to accomplish what power, wealth, and 3 years of hopelessness had all failed to do, while awakening a truth the Kavanagh family had buried for decades. If this opening has sparked your curiosity, please hit the like button to encourage us. Don't forget to share this story with those who believe forgiveness is impossible. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the emotional chapters still to come. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor, steady and unhurried, and perhaps it was that quiet composure that first caught Rowan's attention. The woman walking toward him from the far end of the hallway looked nothing like any of the 19 people who'd come before her. She wasn't dressed in a spotless white medical uniform. She wasn't carrying a polished leather briefcase, or wearing the hurried expression of someone eager to impress a wealthy family. Resting on her shoulder was an old accordion tucked inside a worn cloth case. In her other hand, she carried a simple canvas bag. Her auburn hair was gathered into a loose bun at the back of her neck, with a few wisps falling gently across her forehead. She wore a faded gray sweater and a pair of low-heeled shoes with worn soles. Surrounded by walnut-paneled walls and gilded picture frames, she seemed strangely out of place, yet she didn't appear uncomfortable in the slightest. She stopped a respectful distance from Rowan and looked directly into his eyes without hesitation, without lowering her gaze the way people usually did when they found themselves standing before him. "You're Rowan Kavanagh, aren't you?" she asked, her voice so calm it was almost gentle. "I'm Maeve Sullivan. They asked me to come here." Fionn, standing behind Rowan, frowned ever so slightly, while the 2 guards in the hallway exchanged puzzled glances, because no one had ever spoken to their employer with the casual ease of someone chatting with a neighbor. "You've read the file, haven't you?" Rowan asked, his cold gray eyes studying every movement she made. "I have," Maeve replied. "And you're still taking the job?" he continued, unable to hide the doubt in his voice. "My grandfather has driven away the 19 people before you. He'll humiliate you. He'll throw things. He may force you out before you've even had the chance to tell him your name." Maeve smiled softly, a smile that carried no trace of strain. "Then I'll leave if that's truly what he wants." Rowan narrowed his eyes slightly. "No one leaves willingly after meeting him," he said. Her answer brought the entire hallway to a silent pause. People don't walk away because of anger. They walk away because they stop seeing the person behind that anger. For a single moment, the first time that entire morning, Rowan didn't know how to answer, because her words touched something he'd never dared to name throughout the past 3 years. Maeve didn't wait for him to recover. Her eyes drifted toward the wall covered with family photographs, and stopped at an old picture of a dark-haired woman smiling beside the sea. Then she spoke quietly. "Her name was Nuala, wasn't it?" Rowan turned sharply toward her, and this time he was the one who lost his composure. "How do you know that?" She studied the photograph a little longer before answering. "I can see the way the people in this picture look at each other. And in the other photographs I noticed your grandfather is still wearing his wedding ring, even though many years have passed. People only keep wearing a ring like that when they still haven't allowed themselves to let go." Fionn looked at Rowan, then at the unfamiliar woman, and deep inside the seasoned consigliere rose a feeling he couldn't quite explain. The sense that the woman who'd just stepped through those gates wasn't simply another caregiver. Rowan remained silent for a long time, long enough for the ticking of the grandfather clock at the end of the hallway to become unmistakably clear. At last he gave the slightest nod toward the heavy wooden door that remained tightly shut. "He's in there," he said, his voice quieter now. "And I need to tell you something first. I can't promise you anything." Maeve nodded, and gently set her canvas bag on the floor, keeping only the accordion in her hands. "I don't need a promise," she replied. "I only need a door." She walked past him, leaving behind the faint scent of dried grass and aged wood. And when her hand rested upon the brass doorknob that Rowan himself hadn't been able to turn only moments earlier, one of the guards hurried forward, intending to stop her, but Fionn quietly lifted a hand, signaling for everyone to let her be. Every person standing in that hallway, the physicians, the servants, the armed bodyguards, held their breath as they watched the small figure before them. And Rowan realized his own heart was beating faster, in a way he hadn't felt for a very long time, that fragile and dangerous feeling called hope. The door slowly opened. A breath of cold air carrying the faint scent of medicine drifted out into the hallway. Then the door closed behind her once again, leaving everyone outside wrapped in a silence stretched as tightly as a string about to snap. The moment the door closed behind her, the silence outside became so dense that Rowan could hear the sound of his own breathing. Inside the room, no one could see what was happening. They could only listen, and everyone standing in the hallway found themselves silently counting each passing second. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Then Declan Kavanagh's familiar roar ripped through the silence. "Get out!" The shout rang out, dry and furious, followed by the sound of something being knocked over and rolling across the floor. Fionn closed his eyes for a brief moment. 20 seconds, he murmured. She's already broken the record. Everyone waited for the sound of the door flying open. They expected to hear the frantic footsteps of the 20th woman running away just as the 19 before her had done. But nothing happened. Instead, more sounds drifted from inside the room. Furniture scraped across the floor. The old man's breathing came in harsh, angry bursts. Then another shout followed, weaker this time, rougher, drained of strength. And after that came silence. 1 minute passed. No sound of breaking glass. No shouting. 2 minutes. Fionn frowned and looked toward Rowan. What on earth was happening in there? Rowan didn't answer. He slowly walked closer to the door. He didn't open it. He simply rested his ear against the thick wood and listened. What he heard made his entire body go still. From inside the room came something so soft, so fragile it was almost like mist. It was the sound of a melody. Not words, not medical instructions, not the empty, comforting phrases the 19 before her had all tried. It was the voice of an accordion, releasing one note at a time, slowly, delicately, almost trembling, as though the musician were feeling her way across the keys in complete darkness. It was an old Irish folk song, a melody filled with quiet sorrow and gentle tenderness. born among the windswept coastal hills across the ocean, the kind of song no one in this house should have remembered anymore. Rowan stood frozen because he knew that song. He'd heard it when he was a little boy, inside the old kitchen, while Nuala kneaded bread dough and softly hummed it every Sunday morning in her warm, gentle voice. It was her song, and no one outside this family had ever known it. The melody continued, imperfect yet deeply heartfelt, filling a room that for 3 years had echoed with nothing except anger and destruction. Then, woven gently between those notes, another sound emerged, so faint that at first no one trusted what they were hearing. A quiet sob, then another, then the sound of someone breaking down completely, weeping in ragged, uncontrollable waves, rising from the chest of the man no one had seen shed a single tear in 3 long years. Declan Kavanagh was crying. The man who'd survived war, betrayal, imprisonment, and countless attempts on his life. The man who could once make even the most stubborn opponent bow his head with nothing more than a calm sentence, was now crying like a widower standing before his wife's grave. Out in the hallway, several servants covered their mouths with trembling hands. One physician quietly turned away, and Fionn, who'd served the Kavanagh family for nearly his entire life, could only stand there in silence, because the last time he'd heard those tears had been at Nuala's funeral many years before. Rowan kept his hand against the door. He didn't open it. He didn't step inside. He couldn't bring himself to disturb the fragile moment unfolding beyond that wall. Then he realized his own cheek was wet. He raised a hand and touched it in quiet disbelief, because it had been so long that he'd forgotten what tears felt like. For 3 years he'd fought against that room. For 3 years he'd poured into it wealth, the finest physicians, the most expensive medicines, and the nameless despair of a grandson forced to watch the legendary man he'd admired slowly fade away. Yet a stranger, armed with nothing more than an old accordion and a forgotten song, had accomplished in 60 seconds what power, wealth, medicine, and even his own family's love had all failed to do. And as Rowan stood motionless outside that door, listening to the music and the tears flowing together as one, a vague premonition sent a chill down his spine. The woman who'd just walked into that room might not have come only to heal his grandfather. She might also be about to uncover something the Kavanagh family had buried for a very long time. The morning sunlight poured through the towering windows overlooking the ocean, spreading a warm golden glow across the cold marble floors. And for the first time in a very long while, the Kavanagh family's seaside mansion rested in an unfamiliar kind of silence. There was no sound of vinyl records shattering, no angry shouting echoing from the old man's room, no whispered conversations in the corners of the hallway, no servants tiptoeing through the house as though afraid of waking a dangerous beast. There was only silence, but this time, it was a peaceful silence. Rowan had hardly slept at all. He'd remained in his study throughout the night, pretending to review stacks of harbor documents, when in truth he'd done nothing except replay that impossible moment over and over in his mind. The music, the tears, and even the tears he'd shed himself. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, Fionn entered carrying a cup of hot coffee. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I wasn't sleepy," Rowan replied. Fionn glanced toward the bedroom wing. "Neither was I." Rowan looked up. "Has she come out yet?" "Not once," Fionn answered quietly, "and there wasn't a single sound all night." Rowan slowly rose to his feet. For 3 years, every morning had begun the same way. He'd prepared himself for another crisis, another caregiver handing in a resignation, another room left in ruins, another painful reminder that the strongest man he'd ever known no longer wanted to live. Yet this morning there was nothing at all, and somehow that quiet unsettled him far more than any furious outburst ever had. He walked down the hallway as the 2 guards silently stepped aside. Just as he raised his hand to knock, the heavy wooden door slowly opened on its own. Maeve stepped out carrying a tray with an empty bowl of porridge resting upon it. She looked exhausted, yet there was an astonishing calmness in her eyes. A loose strand of auburn hair had escaped her bun and rested against her cheek. "Good morning," she said softly. Instinctively, Rowan searched her face for a bruise, some sign of fear, any trace that she'd suffered through the night, but there was nothing except gentle weariness. "You stayed all night," he said. "He asked me to stay," Maeve answered. Rowan froze. "My grandfather asked you?" She nodded. "He couldn't sleep, and he didn't want to be alone." "What happened in there?" Rowan asked, his voice quieter than before. Maeve didn't answer immediately. She carefully placed the tray on a small table at the end of the hallway before speaking. "People always think healing begins with muscles, with medicine, with therapy exercises," she said. "But sometimes it begins with permission." "Permission to do what?" Rowan asked. "Permission to grieve," she replied. "For 3 years, everyone has tried to make your grandfather become strong again. Everyone has wanted to bring back the man he used to be, but no one has ever given him permission to mourn the life he'd lost." Her words settled heavily between them, and Rowan suddenly realized that throughout all those years he'd hired the finest neurologists, the most expensive therapists, yet never once had he stopped to ask whether his grandfather had still been allowed to fall apart. "He told me about an old boathouse," Maeve continued, her voice even gentler now. Rowan paused, almost imperceptibly. "He said that many years ago, he taught a little boy there how to tie a boat to its mooring post, patiently weaving each loop of rope beneath the afternoon sun, and that little boy kept getting it wrong until his tiny hands finally learned to do it properly." Rowan felt his throat tighten, because only 3 people in the world had ever known about that boathouse, and that afternoon, his grandmother, his grandfather, and Rowan himself. "He hasn't spoken about that place since my grandmother died," he whispered, almost to himself. "I know," Maeve replied. "And every time he speaks about her, he cries." Rowan turned away and looked through the window at the ocean shimmering beneath the morning sunlight. For the first time in a very long time, something fragile began to stir inside his chest, a feeling he'd almost forgotten the name of. At that very moment, the heavy wooden door creaked softly as it opened a little wider, and Declan Kavanagh appeared in the doorway. His body still bore the scars left by his illness. His silver hair had grown thinner than before. One shoulder sagged lower than the other. But his eyes, those eyes had changed. The exhaustion was still there. The pain was still there. Yet for the first time in 3 years, they were no longer empty. They held awareness. They held presence. He looked straight at Rowan. Grandfather and grandson stood there facing one another without a single word, and for that brief moment, it seemed the entire hallway had forgotten how to breathe. Then Declan slowly raised his trembling hand, not toward Rowan, but toward Maeve. She immediately stepped to his side. "What do you need?" she asked softly. The old man shifted his gaze toward the bookshelf against the wall. Maeve understood at once. She walked over, took down a worn leather-bound photo album, and gently placed it into his hands. Declan carefully rested his hand over hers for a brief moment, a quiet gesture of gratitude. Then he turned back toward Rowan. His lips struggled to move, and after several painful attempts, a single word finally emerged, slow, hoarse, yet unmistakably clear. "Sit." Behind them, Fionn nearly dropped the folder he was holding, because it was the very first time since his illness that Declan had willingly invited a member of his family into his room. Rowan stepped inside with careful hesitation, as though he feared that one movement too sudden might shatter the fragile miracle unfolding before him. The room no longer resembled a battlefield. The broken pieces of porcelain had all been cleared away. The heavy curtains had been drawn completely open, allowing the morning sunlight to flood the room and illuminate the wall covered with family photographs. Maeve hadn't replaced anything expensive inside that room. She'd simply opened every window wide, allowing fresh ocean air, carrying the salty scent of the sea, to sweep away the suffocating smell of medicine that had lingered there for so long. Declan slowly turned the pages of the album. Inside were photographs faded by the passing decades, capturing nearly half a century of memories: wedding pictures, family dinners, summers spent beside the sea. Then his trembling finger came to rest upon one photograph, and Rowan found himself holding his breath. In the picture, a little boy of about 6 years old sat proudly upon Declan's shoulders, his tiny arms wrapped around the old man's head, while beside them, Nuala leaned against him smiling, her dark hair dancing in the sea breeze. Rowan had forgotten that this photograph had ever existed. His grandfather's finger gently traced the face of the woman in the picture, and another tear slowly rolled down the deeply lined curve of his cheek. Maeve quietly offered him a handkerchief. She never hurried him, she never spoke for him, she never treated him like a helpless invalid. She treated him only as a human being who was hurting. Many minutes passed in silence, accompanied only by the distant sound of waves drifting in from the open sea. Then Declan softly managed another word. His voice was still strained, yet clearer than before. Beautiful. Rowan looked at him. Your grandmother, the old man continued, his eyes never leaving Nuala's face in the photograph, and Rowan understood that he was speaking about her. He sat there beside the grandfather he'd believed he'd lost forever during those 3 long years, listening to each broken word the old man struggled to release, like the first pebbles rolling once again through a stream that had been dry for far too long. And Rowan realized that this was the beginning of something, a door that had finally begun to open after remaining sealed shut for so many years. Across the room, Maeve quietly stepped back and stood against the wall, understanding that some moments belonged only to a grandfather and his grandson. A gentle smile, touched with quiet sadness, briefly crossed her lips, as though she herself were remembering something from a distant past she'd never shared with another soul. A few days later, when Declan's health had improved enough for him to sit outdoors for a little while each afternoon, Maeve helped him into the small garden behind the mansion, where an old stone bench rested beneath the spreading branches of a weathered maple tree overlooking the sea. He loved sitting there, quietly watching the waves roll in, and she usually left him alone with his thoughts while she tidied the garden nearby. That afternoon, as she bent down to pick up the light blanket that had slipped from his knees, Maeve's eyes accidentally drifted toward the shadow beneath the stone bench, where ivy vines had crept over and wrapped themselves around its base. A corner of something wooden protruded through the leaves, smooth and perfectly square, nothing like a rock or a tree root. She paused for a moment, then gently brushed the vines aside with her hand. It was a small wooden box, old and weathered, carefully hidden beneath the bench, as though someone had deliberately placed it where no one would ever think to look. She hesitated before quietly lifting the lid. Inside lay an entire bundle of letters, dozens of envelopes stacked neatly together and tied with a blue ribbon that had faded with the passing years. Every envelope bore the same graceful, elegant handwriting and the same name, Nuala Kavanagh. Maeve felt her heartbeat quicken ever so slightly. These weren't ordinary family keepsakes. Many of the letters remained perfectly sealed, never having been opened, but one envelope had already been unsealed, and across its front, written in ink blurred by time and in trembling handwriting, completely unlike the graceful script covering the rest of the letters, was a sentence that sent a chill racing down her spine. If Rowan ever learns the truth. Maeve didn't read another word. She sat perfectly still for a long moment, the box resting in her hands, feeling the weight of something that didn't belong to her. Then she quietly closed the lid, carefully returned the box to its original place beneath the stone bench, and gently pulled the ivy back over it exactly as she'd found it, because she understood that some secrets belonged to a family, not to a stranger, and at least not yet. As she rose and turned around, she found Rowan standing on the veranda watching her. His gray eyes were fixed upon her, and not a single emotion showed on his face. "Did you find something?" he asked, his voice calm yet sharp as a knife. Maeve hesitated. "A box," she answered honestly. "What kind of box?" he asked. "I didn't open it," she replied. One of Rowan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You expect me to believe that?" She looked directly into his eyes without looking away. "I wasn't hired to satisfy my own curiosity," she answered calmly. "I was hired to help your grandfather." A long silence settled between them, as they simply stood there, listening to the sea breeze whisper through the maple leaves overhead. At last, Rowan slowly nodded. "Most people in this house would have opened it," he said quietly. "Most people aren't me," Maeve replied. The faintest smile touched the corner of Rowan's mouth, before disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. It was closer to genuine amusement than anyone had seen from him in many years. It was also the first moment he'd felt that, within the world of deception and calculation he'd lived in for so long, he might have finally met someone he could trust. That evening, after the last traces of sunset had disappeared beyond the sea, and the entire mansion had settled into silence, Maeve returned to Declan's room to tidy up and prepare his evening medication tray, as she always did. Besides providing music therapy, she also took care of the daily responsibilities the Kavanagh family had no longer been able to keep anyone around to handle. She'd always been a careful person, accustomed to recording every dose of medicine and every scheduled hour with meticulous precision. So, as she arranged the pills into the small tray, she instinctively compared them with the dosage chart attached to the inside of the medicine cabinet. It was then that something made her stop. One bottle contained fewer pills than the dosage chart indicated it should. She frowned, telling herself perhaps she'd remembered incorrectly, so she checked the second bottle, then the third. None of them matched. The actual number of pills remaining inside the cabinet didn't correspond with the amount that should have been left according to the documented medication schedule. At first, Maeve convinced herself that perhaps she'd simply counted incorrectly or made a mistake somewhere while she'd been busy, so she took down Declan's medication records and began carefully turning through each page. She reviewed every entry from the previous several weeks with painstaking attention, comparing every dose, every signature, every number. And the more she read, the colder she felt. Nothing matched. There were days when medication dosages had been changed without a physician's signature anywhere on the record. There were scheduled doses left blank, only to be filled in later using entirely different handwriting. There were adjustments to medication amounts with no accompanying explanation, not a single note, not a single reason, not even the slightest indication that an emergency had required the change. Maeve sat quietly beside the medicine cabinet, the medical file spread open across her lap, while thoughts collided relentlessly inside her mind. She'd cared for many patients. She'd worked alongside every kind of medical professional. She knew experienced caregivers rarely made the exact same mistakes over and over again. One person might record something incorrectly once, perhaps even twice. But an entire pattern of identical discrepancies involving the very same medication, continuing for weeks, was no longer an accident. She tried convincing herself that perhaps the 19 caregivers before her had simply kept careless records, that the chaos surrounding this room throughout the past 3 years was enough to explain everything. But the instincts she'd developed through years of caring for others kept warning her that something wasn't right, that something deliberate was hiding behind the appearance of ordinary numbers. She remembered Declan's words that afternoon. She remembered the look in his eyes whenever someone mentioned his medication, that strange expression of quiet surrender, as though he'd long ago accepted whatever awaited him. Then she remembered the trembling words written across the envelope hidden beneath the stone bench. If Rowan ever learns the truth. A vague uneasiness slowly crept into her heart. The connection between the missing pills and the hidden letters was still far too fragile to define, yet it was enough to make her chest tighten. Someone had been quietly, systematically altering the old man's medication schedule for a very long time. But who? And for what purpose? Maeve gently closed the medical file and rested her hand upon its cold leather cover for a long moment. She understood that she was standing before a threshold that, once crossed, offered no path back. She knew the questions she was about to ask probably wouldn't please anyone living inside this powerful house. But she also knew that the elderly man sleeping peacefully behind her, the man who'd only just begun to recover his voice and the light within his eyes, deserved to have someone speak on his behalf. And that night, for the first time since she'd stepped inside the Kavanagh mansion, Maeve realized that her work might no longer be simply about healing a broken heart. The following morning, Maeve went to see Sister Brigid, a retired nun who'd once been Nuala Kavanagh's companion during the final months of her life. Although she'd long since retired from her duties, every Thursday she still visited the mansion, quietly sitting inside the small chapel overlooking the seaside garden to pray, and she was one of the very few people still living who'd remained connected to the Kavanagh family for so many years. When Maeve stepped inside, the silver-haired nun looked up. Her eyes were gentle, yet remarkably perceptive. She studied Maeve for a brief moment, before softly saying, "Something is weighing on your heart." Maeve sat down on the wooden chair beside her. "I have one question," she replied. "Just one, at least for now." Sister Bridget offered a faint smile. The two women sat together beneath the soft light filling the chapel, while the delicate chime of the wind bells drifted in from the veranda. "I've been reviewing Mr. Kavanagh's medication records," Maeve said slowly. "And none of them make sense." The smile on the nun's face quietly faded, almost too subtly to notice. "What doesn't make sense?" she asked. "Medication dosages were changed without a physician's signature," Maeve answered. "There are missing entries, unexplained adjustments, no notes, no reasons." Sister Bridget turned her face toward the garden, her hands tightening around the rosary beads she held. "Has anyone ever questioned those things?" Maeve asked, lowering her voice. The elderly nun remained silent for a long time. "Questions are dangerous things in powerful families," she finally said, her voice low and cautious. "I'm not asking about power," Maeve replied quietly. "I'm asking about the truth." For several seconds, the only sounds between them were birds, singing somewhere in the distance, and the steady whisper of waves, breaking against the rocks below. Then Sister Bridget let out a slow, heavy sigh, as though she'd carried this burden for far too many years. "Nuala believed someone wanted her Salvatore," she began softly, before correcting herself. "I mean, Mr. Declan, to remain dependent on others forever." Maeve felt her heart tighten. She truly believed that? "She did," the nun nodded. "Did she know who it was?" Maeve continued. "No," Sister Bridget answered. "She never knew exactly who it was, but she knew something terribly wrong was happening inside her own home." She paused, her gaze drifting into the distance, as though she were looking back toward a long-forgotten past. "And before she died," she continued, before suddenly falling silent, as though she'd reached a boundary she wasn't certain she should cross. Maeve waited patiently, never urging her to continue. "Before she died, she wrote letters," the nun finally said. Maeve shivered almost imperceptibly. She thought of the wooden box hidden beneath the stone bench, of the faded blue ribbon, of the trembling words she'd seen written across that single envelope. "You've already seen them, haven't you?" Sister Bridget suddenly looked directly at her, her eyes unexpectedly sharp. Maeve didn't hide the truth. "I found them," she admitted, "but I didn't read them." "Good," the nun said softly, her voice carrying both relief and sorrow. "They weren't written for curious eyes." Then she placed her thin, weathered hand gently over Maeve's. "They were written for broken hearts." Maeve felt the trembling in that frail hand, and she understood that the woman sitting before her had carried this fear silently for many years without ever daring to speak it aloud. "You must be careful," Sister Bridget continued, her voice filled with quiet urgency. Nuala was an intelligent and remarkably strong woman. Yet in the end, someone made even her believe she was losing her mind, that everything she'd seen was nothing more than imagination. If that could happen to her, it could happen to you as well. Maeve sat in silence while the scattered pieces inside her mind slowly began fitting together into a shape that was still blurred, yet deeply unsettling. The missing pills, the hidden letters, a woman who'd died after trying to leave behind a warning that no one had been willing to hear. And for the first time, Maeve realized that Declan Kavanagh's silence throughout the past 3 years might not have been caused entirely by his illness. While Maeve quietly carried her growing suspicions, Rowan, in another corner of the mansion, was beginning to follow a faint thread he'd ignored for far too long. That night, he sat alone in his grandfather's old study, a room almost no one had touched since Declan had fallen ill. The heavy walnut bookshelves were still lined with leather-bound ledgers, and on the desk rested a family photograph he'd never really noticed before, one in which his grandparents were smiling at each other instead of looking into the camera. He was lost in thought when a soft knock came at the door. Fionn stepped inside, carrying a thick folder beneath his arm. "There's something you need to see," the seasoned consigliere said. his voice unusually cautious. "What is it?" Rowan asked. "It's Cormac," Fionn replied. "Our chief attorney." Rowan frowned slightly. "What's happened to him?" Fionn placed the folder on the desk and pulled out a stack of photographs. "He's met privately with Dr. Pierce, 4 times this month alone." Rowan picked up the photographs. They were surveillance images, taken from a distance, each one stamped with a date and time in the lower corner. In every photograph, Cormac Doyle, the silver-haired man who always wore elegant leather gloves, was standing beside the family's private cardiologist, near a vehicle parked behind an old warehouse, well out of sight. "Always after business hours," Fionn continued. "Always in isolated places. Never at the hospital. Never at the corporate offices." Rowan slowly turned through the photographs, his gray eyes growing darker with each one. "Maybe they're just friends," he said, though even he didn't believe the words as they left his mouth. "That's what I thought too," Fionn replied, "until I examined the financial records." He placed another file onto the desk. "These are the financial reports. I had someone review everything very carefully. Pierce's consulting company received 3 large wire transfers from one of the shell companies controlled by Cormac." Rowan looked up sharply. "When?" Fionn remained silent for a brief moment before answering. "The first payment was transferred exactly 1 week after your after your grandfather, became ill." The room suddenly grew so quiet that Rowan could hear the steady ticking of the grandfather clock out in the hallway. He sat motionless, his eyes fixed upon the figures printed across the page while, inside his mind, scattered fragments began crashing together. For 3 years, he'd trusted Cormac Doyle almost as completely as he'd trusted his own grandfather. The man had stood beside the Kavanagh family for more than 20 years. He'd quietly managed nearly all of the organization's legitimate businesses. He'd attended birthday celebrations, graduation ceremonies, and family holidays. He'd guided Rowan after Nuala's death, when he was still a lost and grieving boy. He'd stood beside him at her funeral like a second father. If what lay inside these files was true, then this betrayal reached far deeper than stolen money. It reached the very foundation of trust itself. "What are you going to do?" Fionn asked quietly. Rowan didn't answer immediately. He laid the photographs back on the desk, rose to his feet, and walked toward the window overlooking the dark ocean, where distant lighthouses blinked like silent eyes keeping watch. He thought about his grandfather, about the way the old man had only just begun finding his words again, about the faint light that had finally returned to his eyes. He thought about the woman carrying an old accordion, who'd awakened something that neither he nor all his wealth had ever been able to restore. Then he thought about the box hidden beneath the stone bench, the one she'd chosen not to open. "Not yet," he finally said, his voice low and cold. "The moment Cormac realizes we suspect him, he'll erase every trace. So we'll let him believe he's completely safe until I have every piece of evidence firmly in my hands." Fionn nodded as he gathered the photographs together again. But before leaving, he paused in the doorway. "Rowan," he said softly, "if all of this is true, then it began a very long time ago, long before your grandfather ever became ill." Rowan didn't turn around. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness stretching across the sea. "I know," he answered quietly, "and that's exactly what frightens me." That night, a few miles from the mansion, a black sedan sat hidden in the darkness behind an abandoned warehouse in the old harbor district, where the streetlights couldn't reach, and the sound of waves striking weathered wooden pilings was the only thing disturbing the silence. Dr. Nathaniel Pierce hurried from his own car, pulling the collar of his coat up to shield his face, before slipping into the back seat of the waiting sedan. Inside, another man was already seated. His tailored suit was flawless. His silver hair was neatly combed. His leather-gloved hands rested calmly upon his knees. Cormac Doyle didn't turn his head. He simply stared into the darkness beyond the fogged window. "You seem worried," Cormac said, his voice so calm it was chilling. "I am worried," Pierce replied, his breathing still uneven. "The old man is getting better." For a brief moment, not a single expression crossed Cormac's face. Then he spoke quietly. "That's unfortunate." Pierce lowered his voice. That music therapist has changed everything. How much has he recovered? Cormac asked, narrowing his eyes slightly. He's remembering things, Pierce answered. He asked to go out into the garden. He wanted to look through the family photographs again. He's recognizing familiar faces, and he's begun speaking. Silence filled the car, thick and heavy. Cormac slowly removed one leather glove, then slipped it back on again, a habit he'd always had whenever he was carefully weighing his next move. Then, adjust his medication, he finally said, just enough to slow him down again. Pierce swallowed hard, uneasiness spreading across his face. We've maintained this balance for almost 3 years. If we push it any further, someone will notice. Then make sure no one notices. Cormac interrupted, his voice remaining soft but sharp as steel. I don't need him to collapse. I only need him to remain quiet. Pierce hesitated. Why don't we just let this come to an end? The words escaped before he could stop them, and he regretted them immediately. Cormac slowly turned to face the physician for the first time during their conversation, and the look in his eyes sent a chill straight through Pierce's body. Because you're a fool if you think that, Cormac said. As long as Declan Kavanagh remains alive, every authorization bearing his signature remains legally valid. Every account in his name stays active, and I can continue moving those funds anywhere I choose, without anyone asking a single question. He paused, allowing every word to settle. But the moment he dies, complete control passes immediately to his grandson. And the very first thing someone like Rowan will do is order a complete audit of every dollar in the family's books. When that happens, everything I've built over more than 20 years will be dragged into the light. Pierce's face turned pale. For the first time, he understood the entire picture he'd been serving as only one small piece of. That's why we need him alive, Cormac continued. Alive, but silent. Alive, but dependent. Alive like a shadow who can't sign a single document or remember a single name. That's exactly what worked perfectly for the past 3 years until that woman appeared. Silence settled over the car once again, broken only by the wind from the sea whistling through the narrow gap around the window. And what about her? Pierce asked quietly. Cormac turned his face toward the darkness outside, his cold eyes reflecting the faint glow of the moon. Rowan can never be allowed to discover why his grandfather fell into silence, he said slowly. And if that woman continues awakening things that were meant to remain buried, then unfortunately, he paused as he finished pulling his glove snugly back onto his hand. She'll have to go. Pierce sat motionless on the back seat, feeling the full weight of those words pressing down upon his chest. And for the first time during their 3 years of working together, he suddenly realized that the man sitting beside him wasn't merely greedy. He was willing to do absolutely anything to protect the silent empire he'd spent decades building upon the slow destruction of another human being. At the very same time, on the opposite side of the mansion, Declan Kavanagh sat alone in his room, his trembling hands gently cradling an old photograph of Nuala that had faded with the passing years. The glow from the bedside lamp cast shifting patterns of light and shadow across his face, and within his weary eyes burned a quiet determination no one had seen for a very long time. Throughout the past several days, ever since his voice had slowly begun returning, and his memories had started fitting themselves back together, he'd been silently wrestling with a decision he knew he could no longer postpone. With tremendous effort, he reached toward the drawer of his bedside table, searched carefully inside, and finally withdrew a small brass key dulled by decades of age. It was the key that opened the wooden box hidden beneath the stone bench in the garden. He held it tightly inside his palm for a long moment, as though weighing 2 choices that were equally heavy upon his heart. When Maeve entered carrying his evening tea tray, he looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her stop in the doorway. Slowly, he extended his trembling hand toward her and opened his fingers, revealing the small brass key resting in his palm. Maeve set the tea tray down and walked quietly to his side, confusion flickering across her face. "What is this for?" she asked softly. Declan's eyes filled with tears. He struggled to speak, his lips moving with painful effort, and after several failed attempts, He finally managed to force out a few broken words through his trembling mouth. "Find," he whispered. "Nuala." Then he stopped, breathing heavily, as he gathered what little strength remained. "Before," he continued with great difficulty, "they find it." A chill ran slowly down Maeve's spine. She knelt beside his chair and looked directly into his aged eyes. "Why don't you give it to Rowan?" she asked gently. "He's your grandson." Declan slowly shook his head. In that moment, although his words remained broken and incomplete, Maeve understood everything he couldn't say simply by looking into his eyes. He was afraid, not for himself, but for his grandson. He knew Rowan better than anyone else. He understood that beneath his calm and controlled exterior lived a fire capable of erupting without warning. If he placed the key and the truth directly into Rowan's hands now, before every piece of the puzzle had come together, he knew his grandson would act on impulse. He'd charge straight toward his enemies before seeing the traps waiting for him, and in doing so, he'd be walking willingly toward his own destruction. "Rowan," Declan whispered, his eyes pleading with her. Then he lifted his trembling hand and pressed it against his own chest. "Hot," he managed to say, trying to describe the fierce temper and uncontrollable passion that had always lived inside his grandson. Maeve understood. He trusted her, not because she was closer to him than Rowan was, but because throughout 3 long years, inside a mansion filled with physicians, attorneys, bodyguards, and servants, she'd been the first and only person willing to truly sit beside him and listen, without judging him, without rushing him, without treating him like an invalid or a pawn. He needed someone calm enough to uncover the truth without allowing anger to cloud her judgment, and that person was her. Maeve reached out with both hands and gently accepted the brass key from his open palm, feeling the surprising weight carried by something so small. "I promise you," she whispered, her voice tightening with emotion. "I'll be careful." Declan slowly closed his eyes, as a single tear rolled down the deeply lined curve of his cheek, and his hand gently squeezed hers, in a silent expression of gratitude he could no longer put into words. When Maeve finally left the room, the cold brass key resting securely in her palm, she realized this was no longer simply the story of a family struggling to heal. Someone had spent 3 years making certain that Declan Kavanagh would remain silent forever. And now, that person was about to face the truth that the silence they'd worked so hard to preserve was finally beginning to break. Late that night, as Rowan walked through the back garden on his way to his study, he suddenly came to a stop when he heard a melody drifting from the old glass conservatory at the far end of the grounds. It was the sound of an accordion, but not a cheerful Irish folk tune or one of the songs his grandfather loved. It was a melody that moved slowly, deeply sorrowful, and heartbreakingly gentle, the kind of music people only play when they believe no one is left to listen. He paused beside the slightly open door, and through the misted glass he saw Maeve sitting alone on an old wooden chair among rows of flower pots. The accordion rested against her chest, her eyes were closed, and beneath the pale silver light of the moon, silent tears slipped down her cheeks. He knew he should leave, allowing her to keep that private moment to herself. But something about the loneliness in the way she sat held him where he stood. "You don't have to hide it," Rowan said quietly. Maeve opened her eyes in surprise, her fingers freezing on the accordion keys, and for a brief moment she awkwardly brushed the tears from her face. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know anyone was here." Rowan stepped inside and sat on the chair across from her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "That song is painfully sad," he said. Maeve gave him a faint smile, one touched with quiet bitterness. "Some songs aren't played to bring joy," she replied softly. "They're played so we can remember." He remained silent, watching her, and perhaps it was that silence that made her feel safe enough to continue. "I once had a family of my own," she said quietly, her eyes drifting toward the darkness beyond the glass walls. "A small home. We weren't wealthy, but we had everything we needed." Rowan didn't interrupt. He simply waited. "Then I lost them," Maeve continued, her voice steady though every word carried tremendous weight. "It was a loss that, even now, I still can't find the right name for." She paused and drew a slow breath. "For a very long time afterward, I tried to survive the way everyone kept telling me I should. Be strong, keep moving forward, forget. But the harder I forced myself to forget, the more shattered I became." Rowan sat perfectly still, because in her words he heard something painfully familiar. "It took me a very long time to understand," Maeve said, her voice growing gentler, "that no one can force another person to move beyond their grief. Grief isn't a doorway you can push someone through. It's a dark room, and the only thing you can really do is walk into that room and sit beside them, so they'll know they don't have to endure it alone." She looked up at him, her eyes still shimmering with tears. "That's why I never tried to make your grandfather strong again, the way the 19 people before me did. They came here to fix him, to bring back the man he used to be, but he doesn't need to be fixed. He only needs someone willing to stay with him in that darkness, without running away." Rowan remained seated in silence, and for the first time he truly understood why this small, quiet woman had accomplished what power, wealth, and the finest physicians had all failed to do. It wasn't because she possessed some miracle. It was because she had walked through that dark room herself. She had sat there alone for far too long, long enough to understand what a broken heart truly needs. "Thank you," he said softly. She looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "For not running away," Rowan answered. Inside that quiet glass conservatory, beneath the moonlight and the delicate fragrance of flowers, two people who had believed they had nothing in common, one a powerful mafia leader, and the other a woman carrying wounds that had never fully healed, suddenly realized they recognized something in each other that both had hidden for far too long. And in that fragile moment, an invisible thread quietly drew them closer together. The following morning, Maeve brought the small brass key to Declan's bedside and sat beside him. She told him everything she had discovered, about the missing medication, about Sister Bridget's warning, and about the growing unease that had settled deep within her heart. The old man listened in silence, his eyes growing darker with every word. At last, he slowly nodded, and with the little strength he had, he managed to piece together a sentence. "Together," he whispered, glancing toward the door, making it clear that she should call Rowan so they could open the letters together. That afternoon, the three of them gathered inside Declan's room with the door firmly closed and the heavy curtains drawn. Maeve placed the wooden box on the small table in the center of the room, slipped the brass key into the lock, and with a soft click, the lid sprang open. Rowan stared at the bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and he recognized the handwriting on the envelopes immediately. It was his grandmother's graceful, flowing script, exactly as he remembered it. Declan reached out with his trembling hand and rested it gently on the bundle for a brief moment, before pulling out the one letter that had already been opened, the letter bearing the words, "If Rowan ever learns the truth." He handed it to his grandson. "Read it," he said softly. Rowan took the envelope. His hands that had never trembled even during the most dangerous negotiations, now shook ever so slightly as he unfolded the yellowed sheet of paper. Nuala's handwriting appeared before his eyes, beautiful, confident, and filled with love, exactly as he remembered. He began reading in silence, and after only the first few lines, the color slowly drained from his face. In the letter, Nuala wrote that she had accidentally uncovered something deeply unusual in the financial records of the family's legitimate businesses. She had discovered that profits were quietly being siphoned away into accounts whose names she had never seen before, hidden accounts carefully concealed behind layers of shell companies. At first, she believed it was nothing more than an accounting error, but the more closely she followed the numbers, the more clearly she realized it was a carefully orchestrated scheme that had been unfolding for years, carried out by someone who understood every hidden corner of the family's financial system. She wrote that she had intended to expose the evidence. She had planned to tell Declan everything she knew, but someone had reached him first. Someone had quietly whispered to her husband that she was exhausted, that illness was clouding her mind, that the figures she believed she had uncovered were nothing more than the delusions of a woman whose strength was fading away. And the man she loved, the man who had walked beside her through nearly an entire lifetime, had ultimately believed that person's words, instead of believing her. Nuala wrote her final lines in handwriting far more unsteady than before. She said she didn't blame Declan. She understood that he had been deceived by someone they had both trusted completely. But she was afraid. She was afraid that if this truth were buried along with her one day, that person would continue, and the next one forced to pay the price would be Rowan. When Rowan reached that point, his hand tightened around the edge of the letter until his knuckles turned white. He slowly looked up, every trace of color gone from his face, and within his gray eyes, a violent storm was beginning to rage. "She knew," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Grandmother, knew everything." Declan closed his eyes, tears streaming down both cheeks, and he nodded heavily, as though that single nod had weighed upon his shoulders for 12 long years. "I believed them," he whispered, each broken word filled with unbearable pain. "I failed Nuala." Maeve quietly rested her hand upon his shoulder, and in that moment she finally understood everything. She understood that Declan's silence throughout the past 3 years had never come solely from his illness. It had come from an unbearable burden of guilt, the remorse of a husband who had doubted his wife at the very moment she had needed his trust more than anything else. Rowan slowly laid the letter back upon the table, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so low and cold it sent a chill through the room. "Then now," he said, "we're going to find the person who did this." Cormac Doyle was a man who had survived for more than 20 years, among the most dangerous people on the East Coast, and his instincts had been sharpened enough to recognize the moment the atmosphere around him began to change. He noticed that Fionn was suddenly spending more time poring over old financial ledgers. He noticed that Rowan had become unusually quiet whenever he entered the room. He noticed that the woman who carried the old accordion allowed her gaze to linger on him just a little longer each time their paths crossed. To anyone else, those signs might have meant nothing, but to Cormac, they rang like warning bells. He understood that the wall of silence he had spent 3 years carefully building was beginning to crack, and at the center of those fractures stood Maeve Sullivan. He knew he couldn't act too openly. He couldn't leave behind even the smallest trace that might lead back to him. But he also knew that sometimes a well-timed reminder was more effective than any direct action. Late that afternoon, when Maeve drove her old car into town to buy additional medication for Declan, she sensed that something wasn't right. As she pressed the brake while descending the hill toward the old harbor, the pedal suddenly sank much farther than it should have. The car continued rolling forward before finally coming to a stop, and her heart pounded violently inside her chest. She forced herself to remain calm, pulled the car onto the shoulder, and stepped out to inspect it, though both her hands were still trembling. At that very moment, a polished black sedan slowly pulled up behind her and came to a stop. The rear window lowered halfway, and through the shadows inside the vehicle, she recognized the composed face framed by neatly groomed silver hair. It was Cormac Doyle. "Miss Sullivan?" he said in a courteous voice that sounded as though he were simply asking about her well-being. "It seems your car has developed a problem." Maeve straightened her posture, doing everything she could to keep her voice from shaking. "It seems that way." Cormac smiled, a smile that was impeccably polite, yet utterly cold. "The roads around here are more dangerous than people realize," he said. "Especially for someone who's unfamiliar with them. Someone who's only recently arrived should be very careful. Some things are best left exactly as they are. You understand what I mean, don't you?" Maeve looked directly into his eyes, and although her heart was pounding, her expression remained calm. "I understand perfectly well," she replied. "Good," Cormac said. His eyes lingered on her face for another brief moment, a look that required no words yet carried a message she understood completely. "I hope you make it home safely," he said quietly. Then the window slowly rolled back up, and the black sedan glided away, leaving Maeve standing alone beside the roadside as the fading evening light disappeared into darkness. That night, after returning to the estate, Maeve told Rowan everything that had happened, and she watched his jaw tighten with every word she spoke. He remained silent for a long time after she finished, his gray eyes darkening like the sea before a storm. "He threatened you," he finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "He never said anything outright," Maeve replied. "He didn't have to," Rowan interrupted. "A man like Cormac never has to say things outright." He rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the darkness outside, and Maeve realized that something inside him had changed. Some invisible boundary had just been crossed. For all these years, Cormac might have stolen money. He might have manipulated his grandfather. Rowan had still possessed enough restraint to wait, to gather evidence, and to remain patient. But the moment Cormac dared to bring danger to the woman who had restored laughter to his family, he had crossed a line Rowan could never forgive. Rowan turned back to face her, and there wasn't even the slightest trace of hesitation left in his eyes. "It's time," he said quietly. "Time for what?" Maeve asked. "Time to end this," Rowan replied, "once and for all." The Kavanagh family's annual council meeting had never been postponed. Not because of blizzards, not because of federal investigations, not even after Nuala's death all those years ago. Every leader, every advisor, every senior member understood what that gathering represented. It was loyalty, it was responsibility, it was power. But this year, a strange rumor had spread throughout the organization before sunrise, that Declan Kavanagh would appear in person. At first, no one believed it. For 3 long years, the legendary leader had vanished completely from everyone's sight. Some whispered that he no longer recognized his own grandson. Others insisted that he had permanently lost the ability to speak. Only a very small number of people inside the estate knew the truth, that he had never completely lost his voice. He had simply lost the will to use it. By midday, nearly 40 senior members of the organization had filled the grand hall, where heavy oak-paneled walls displayed photographs, chronicling 5 decades of the family's history. At the front of the room, Rowan stood quietly, impeccably dressed, his composed face revealing nothing at all. Fionn leaned slightly toward him. "Our people are nervous," he murmured. "They should be," Rowan replied. "Are you certain something's going to happen today?" Fionn asked. Rowan's gray eyes slowly drifted toward Cormac Doyle, who stood comfortably among the veteran advisors, greeting everyone with the polished warmth he had perfected over so many years. "I'm certain it will," Rowan answered quietly. On the opposite side of the room, Cormac maintained his flawless composure. Only Dr. Pierce, standing discreetly behind him, noticed the almost invisible tension in the gloved fingers resting at his side. "They know," Pierce whispered. Without turning his head, Cormac replied, "If they truly knew, we wouldn't still be standing here." But the instant those words left his mouth, the enormous wooden doors at the end of the hall slowly swung open, and every conversation died at once. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Every man in the hall rose to his feet. Declan Kavanagh walked inside. He wasn't being carried. He wasn't hidden beneath a blanket in a wheelchair. He walked under his own strength, slowly, leaning upon a polished wooden cane. Every step demanded an effort plainly visible across his face, yet every step was also a victory. Maeve walked quietly beside him, never supporting him, never urging him forward, remaining only close enough to catch him if he needed her. The entire hall fell into a silence that felt almost sacred. Many of the older leaders lowered their heads in respect. A few quietly wiped tears from the corners of their eyes, because they had never believed they would live to see their former leader standing before them again. Declan slowly made his way to the front of the room, where the great leather chair of the family's leader stood waiting, the chair that for so many years had belonged to him alone. Rowan stepped forward and pulled the chair back for him, but Declan gently shook his head. He didn't want to sit, he wanted to stand. Rowan immediately stepped back, honoring his grandfather's wish. For a long moment, Declan slowly looked around the room. His eyes rested upon one familiar face after another. Men who had once fought beside him, men who had buried friends with him, men who had watched Rowan grow from a curious little boy into a formidable leader. Then he spoke, his voice rough, broken, yet unmistakable. It was his voice. "My family," he said. Those 2 simple words echoed through the grand hall. leaving even the hardest men struggling to hold back their emotions. Cormac Doyle stood motionless among the crowd, the smile still fixed upon his lips, but his heart had already begun to pound, because he understood that the man he had believed buried in silence for the past 3 years was now standing before everyone once again. And though Declan's eyes were weary, they burned with a light Cormac had believed he had extinguished forever, the light of a man who was about to speak the truth. Declan paused for a moment to catch his breath, then slowly continued. "I made a mistake." "No." Rowan's voice came back immediately from across the room. His grandfather turned to look at him, and the faintest smile flickered across his exhausted face. "I hid," he whispered, struggling to gather each word. "The truth." The entire hall fell silent. Declan slowly slipped a hand inside his coat and withdrew a yellowed envelope, its surface marked with Nuala's familiar graceful handwriting. Maeve recognized it at once. It was one of the letters hidden beneath the stone bench. With trembling hands, he passed the letter to Rowan. "Read," he said. "Read it out loud." Rowan accepted the paper, and in the absolute silence that filled the great hall, he began reading aloud the words his grandmother had written, with all the fear and courage of a woman who knew her time was running out. His voice was steady and clear, and with every sentence he spoke, the faces of the men gathered in the room grew darker. Nuala had known. She had uncovered someone within the family who had secretly siphoned profits from their legitimate companies into hidden accounts. She had intended to expose everything, and she had been manipulated into believing that she herself was losing her mind. When Rowan finished reading, he slowly lifted his head. His eyes swept across the room before settling on Cormac Doyle. Every other gaze in the hall followed, turning toward him all at once. Cormac remained exactly where he stood, his expression so perfectly calm it was chilling. Not a single muscle in his face moved. "Baseless accusations," he said, his voice still smooth and composed. "A letter written by a gravely ill woman proves nothing." Rowan smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant smile. "No," he replied softly, then gave the slightest nod toward Fionn. The old consigliere immediately stepped forward and placed 3 thick files onto the long table at the center of the room. "A forensic audit," Rowan said, his voice as cold as ice. "Every transfer, every shell company, every signature." Fionn opened the final file. "And every payment made from Cormac Doyle's companies into the accounts of Dr. Nathaniel Pierce." Murmurs of shock spread through the great hall. Pierce staggered backward by a single step, his face drained of color. "I can explain," he stammered. "Then, by all means, explain," Rowan answered. "You've received more than $4 million. The doctor's breathing became rapid. Those were consulting fees. Fionn calmly slid another file across the table toward him. "Then perhaps you can also explain why Mr. Kavanagh's medication was repeatedly altered without authorization from anyone." Pierce's eyes darted toward Cormac, silently begging for help. But the silver-haired man answered only with a cold, emotionless stare. There wasn't the slightest sign of rescue, only ruthless calculation. In that single moment, Pierce finally understood. He'd been nothing more than a pawn, and now he'd become a pawn that could be discarded. A bitter laugh escaped his throat. "For more than 20 years, he said, turning to face Rowan directly, "I did exactly what he told me to do. But if I'm going down today, I won't go down alone." The entire room held its breath. "You think your grandfather was the target," Pierce said, his voice shaking with anger and despair. "No, he never was." Confusion swept across the hall. "The target was you." He pointed directly at Rowan. "As long as your grandfather remained lying there, silent and dependent, you'd never think to investigate the people controlling your family's entire legitimate empire." He pointed toward Cormac. "He controlled everything, the finances, the investments, the real estate deals. You trusted him because your grandfather trusted him." Rowan's face became terrifyingly still. "How much?" he asked. Fionn glanced down at the files before answering quietly. "Approximately $152 million. Outraged cries erupted throughout the hall. Several veteran leaders instinctively reached for the pistols concealed beneath their jackets, and in the midst of the storm that had finally broken loose, Cormac Doyle's ever-present courteous smile disappeared from his face at last. Cormac Doyle stood there, surrounded by furious eyes, and for the first time, the courteous and gracious mask he had worn for so many years finally fell away, revealing the face beneath, cold, arrogant, and utterly without remorse. "You've all disappointed me," he said, his voice astonishingly calm, as though he were the one who'd been betrayed. "I spent more than 20 years making this family wealthier than it ever dared dream it could become. You stole from us," Rowan replied, every word ground through clenched teeth. "I managed risk," Cormac answered. "You poisoned my grandfather," Rowan said, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "I preserved stability," Cormac replied, without the slightest emotion. "You manipulated a woman who was already gravely ill," Rowan continued, and this time his voice broke. Something flickered for the briefest instant in Cormac's eyes, the first crack in the flawless mask he had worn for so long. Then the corner of his mouth curled into the faintest smile, and he uttered the one sentence he never should have spoken. "Nuala should have spent more time worrying about her health," he said. The moment those words left his lips, the entire room seemed to freeze. Then, before anyone could even see Rowan move, it happened. In a single heartbeat, he crossed the room, seized Cormac by the front of his jacket, and slammed him hard against the oak-paneled wall. Rowan's gray eyes had turned almost black now, filled with every ounce of rage born from 3 years of helplessness, from 12 years of grief, from a betrayal that had cut all the way to the bone. Everyone in the room knew he could kill the man where he stood, and not a single person dared move. Cormac still wore an outward mask of composure, but deep within his eyes, for the very first time, a flash of fear appeared. Rowan raised his fist. His entire body trembled with fury, and for one fleeting instant, it seemed that everything which had defined him, his discipline, his composure, the restraint he had spent a lifetime forging, was about to disappear beneath the weight of his anger. Then a voice broke through the silence. "Rowan." Only a single word. Yet it was the strongest, clearest voice Declan Kavanagh had spoken since the day illness struck him. It echoed through the great hall, carrying with it all the unquestioned authority of the legendary leader he had once been. And strangely, at that very moment, Rowan's body relaxed. His fist stopped in midair. He stood there breathing hard, then slowly released Cormac's jacket and stepped back. Because there were commands he had learned to obey his entire life, and his grandfather's voice was one of them. Declan slowly walked forward, each labored step echoing through the absolute silence that had settled over the room. He stopped directly in front of Cormac Doyle, the man who had called himself his friend for more than 30 years. The old man looked straight into the traitor's eyes, and there was no hatred in his gaze, only a disappointment so deep it seemed without end. In that moment, something quiet unfolded throughout the great hall without a single order being spoken. One by one, every leader, every senior member of the organization, the very men who only moments before had been standing beside Cormac, slowly stepped away from him, each in turn, as though shedding something filthy from themselves. No one spoke. No one exchanged a single word. It was simply a silent decision, made together by every soul in the room. And within moments, Cormac Doyle, the man who had stood at the center of power for more than 20 years, the man through whose hands every thread had passed, now stood utterly alone in the middle of the hall, abandoned for the first time in decades. The most dangerous force in that room was no longer Rowan Kavanagh. It was the truth. And there wasn't any amount of money, any measure of power, or any carefully crafted lie left that could stand against it. Declan Kavanagh stood there, his back as straight as his body would allow, facing the man who had once been his closest friend. In the absolute silence of the great hall, he began to speak. His voice was still hoarse and slow, yet every word was clear and heavy with meaning, as though he had gathered everything he had left within himself to say it all at last. "Cormac," he said, calling the traitor by name, and the silver-haired man slowly lifted his eyes to meet his. "I trusted you," Declan said. "I welcomed you into my home. I let you sit at my family's table. I entrusted you with things I never entrusted to anyone outside my own blood." He paused, breathing with difficulty, but his eyes never left Cormac's face. "You betrayed my wife," he continued, his voice trembling but never weakening. "You made me doubt the woman who spent her entire life loving me. You turned the final years of her life into loneliness, and you let her leave this world believing that even her own husband no longer believed in her." Somewhere in the great hall, someone quietly drew in a sharp breath. "You betrayed my grandson," Declan continued, his gaze briefly shifting toward Rowan. "You intended to make him your next victim, watching him trust you just as I once did, only so that one day you could drain away everything this family shed blood to build. And you betrayed this entire family," he said, his voice carrying through every corner of the room. "These are the people who trusted you, who called you one of us." Declan fell silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened, carrying a sorrow that not even 12 years had been able to heal. "For all these years, I've blamed myself," he said. "I've lived with the torment of not believing Nuala, of letting her leave this world alone." He lifted a hand and pressed it gently against his chest, where his aged heart still struggled on with weary beats. "But today, I finally understand that I, too, was only a man deceived by someone I loved like a brother. I forgive myself," he said, every word carrying immense weight, "because I know that's what Nuala would have wanted me to do." Then his eyes hardened, and he looked directly into Cormac's eyes one last time. "But you," he said, "I'll never forgive you." Those words fell into the great hall like a final sentence, and not a single person in the room dared utter another sound. Cormac Doyle opened his mouth as though to say something, but this time no one wanted to hear it, and he realized that every excuse he could possibly offer had become meaningless. Rowan slowly stepped forward until he was standing beside his grandfather, then gave a slight nod. From the far end of the great hall, 2 men from the Kavanagh family walked forward. Alongside them came the people Rowan had quietly contacted in advance, members of the authorities who had been waiting nearby with complete files and overwhelming evidence already in their hands. Cormac didn't resist. He knew the game was over. As they escorted him across the room, not a single leader watched him pass. No one lowered his head. No one reached out a hand. He walked between 2 silent rows of men who had once respected him, and now there remained only contempt and silence. The massive doors closed behind him, and with them, more than 20 years of lies finally came to an end. In the great hall, Declan Kavanagh remained standing in silence for a long while. Then he turned to look at his grandson, and for the first time in 3 long years, there was no anger or torment left upon his face. There was only a quiet peace, as though an unbearable burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Cormac Doyle's arrest sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of Boston. Following the records Rowan had turned over, federal investigators uncovered an extensive financial fraud network that had stretched across many years and operated through countless shell companies. Dr. Nathaniel Pierce permanently lost his medical license after confessing to falsifying treatment records and accepting illicit payments. Newspapers competed to praise Rowan Kavanagh for having the courage to expose the corruption within his own organization. Headlines described him as disciplined, principled, and astonishingly honest. But Rowan paid no attention to any of those headlines. To him, none of it truly mattered, because every morning, before sitting down to review a single business report, he walked out into the garden. There, beneath the old maple tree overlooking the sea, he always found his grandfather sitting peacefully, watching the waves, sometimes with Maeve beside him, sometimes alone with Nuala's photograph resting at his side. Healing, Rowan gradually came to understand, often arrived in the quietest and most unexpected ways. Then one afternoon, Declan surprised everyone in the house by insisting on cooking dinner himself. The chefs immediately protested. "You should be resting." The old man simply smiled. "I've rested long enough." His movements were still slow, and his left hand still trembled, but he measured every ingredient with patience and determination, written plainly across his face. Fresh tomatoes, basil, handmade pasta, exactly the meal Nuala had prepared every Sunday evening for nearly 40 years. The dining room that evening held an atmosphere unlike anything it had known in years. There was no formal table setting, no discussions of business, no security briefings. There were only 3 people sharing a simple family meal together. Declan tasted the sauce, then closed his eyes. "Too salty," he said. Maeve let out a soft laugh. "It only needs another minute." "No, it needs a little sugar," Declan argued. Nuala always added a little sugar. Then she was wrong, Maeve teased. The best tomato sauce should keep its natural tang. The old man pretended to look offended. "Are you saying my wife couldn't cook?" Rowan sat there quietly, watching the scene unfold with gentle amazement. Only a few months earlier, this very room had echoed with the sound of shattered porcelain and furious shouting, and now his grandfather was arguing over a pot of tomato sauce. It was the most beautiful argument Rowan had ever witnessed in his life. After dinner, Declan slowly rose to his feet and motioned for Rowan to follow him into Nuala's old greenhouse, where the afternoon sunlight still lingered upon the flower pots Maeve had spent weeks bringing back to life. The old man stopped beside a weathered wooden chair. Then, without saying a single word, he opened his arms and embraced his grandson. The embrace lasted only a few brief seconds, yet it was the first time the two of them had hugged since Nuala's funeral. "I'm proud," Declan whispered into Rowan's ear, struggling over every word. "Of you." Rowan immediately shook his head. "You don't have to force yourself to speak." "I want to," the old man replied. Then he looked directly into Rowan's eyes. "For all these years, I kept believing I'd failed everyone. I forgot that Nuala married me because she believed I was always worthy of a second chance." Rowan's eyes stung with tears. The old man gently squeezed his grandson's shoulder. "And you gave me that second chance," he said. Neither of them noticed Maeve quietly stepping back toward the greenhouse door, because she understood that some moments belonged only to a grandfather and his grandson. A gentle smile spread across her lips as she quietly left them together. 1 month later, the Kavanagh family charity held its annual gala. But this year, at Declan's request, the event carried an entirely new purpose. It was dedicated to raising funds to build cardiac rehabilitation and music therapy centers for families who couldn't afford private care. "No family," Declan said while preparing for the evening, "should ever lose hope simply because they don't have enough money." The grand ballroom was filled with community leaders, physicians, members of the clergy, and hundreds of distinguished guests. When the doors opened and Declan Kavanagh entered beside Rowan, the entire audience rose to their feet. His cane was still with him, his uneven gait remained unchanged, but so did his dignity. Thunderous applause echoed throughout the hall, and many guests couldn't hold back their tears. After thanking everyone who had supported the cause, Declan slowly made his way to the microphone. Years ago, commanding an entire room had come effortlessly to him. Now every sentence demanded patience and determination. Even so, every word he spoke carried more weight than ever before. "For 3 years, I lived believing my life was over," he said. Then he paused and smiled toward Maeve. "I was wrong." Every eye in the room followed his gaze. Maeve looked visibly embarrassed by the sudden attention. Declan slowly extended his trembling hand toward her, and after a brief hesitation, she walked onto the stage to stand beside him. He turned back to face the crowd. "People call her a therapist," he said softly, before gently shaking his head. "She isn't." He paused again, then spoke with astonishing clarity. "She reminded an old man how to be a husband again, how to be a grandfather again, and finally, how to be himself again." The ballroom erupted into applause. Maeve's eyes filled with tears. She'd devoted her entire career to helping strangers heal. She'd never expected recognition. She'd never sought praise. But the most beautiful words of all came only moments later. Declan looked at Rowan, then at Maeve, and a warm smile spread across his face. "This," he said proudly, "isn't the woman who healed me?" He reached for his grandson's hand, then gently placed it into Maeve's. This is the woman who gave my grandson a reason to smile again. For several long seconds, both Rowan and Maeve stood speechless, while the entire ballroom watched in complete silence. At last, Maeve looked up at him. "I don't know if I'm ready for your world yet," she said quietly. Rowan smiled. "My world isn't what it used to be anymore," he replied. "It's become a better place since the day you walked through my door." Many months later, the old maple tree in Nuala's garden stood taller than ever before. Declan sat peacefully beneath its branches, watching children from the Rehabilitation Foundation laugh and play during a family picnic. Nuala's photograph rested beside him. He gently touched the frame. "We did it," he whispered. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Perhaps it was only the wind. Or perhaps some promises are finally fulfilled, when love proves itself stronger than regret. Rowan and Maeve walked slowly together along the garden path, their hands brushing against each other, and this time neither of them pulled away. Because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't finding the strength to speak again. It's finding someone who's willing to listen. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it so you can enjoy many more moving and unforgettable stories with us every day. How did Rowan and Maeve's story make you feel? Which moment touched you the most? We'd love for you to leave a comment and share what's in your heart. Thank you for spending your time with us, all the way to the very end. We wish you and your loved ones good health, lasting happiness, and peace every single day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in our next video.